Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce, welcome you all to our Arts Heritage Community Dialogue, being hosted by ACSONI and JOINHER Network. I would like to introduce our main speaker for the evening, Professor Chikowero. Unfortunately, our second speaker was unable to join us this evening due to some technical difficulties. Our speakers, as we are placed all over the world, so we have to be flexible and work with each other in order to make it work. However, ACSONI and JOINHER Network have not made a false. Will bring you Professor Saki Mafundikwa at another date to be determined in the future. So without any further delay, we would like to welcome Professor Mhoze Chikowero to enlighten us. Thank you.
Ndinotenda nyati namaswanda Mandlovu and others of our listeners who are here. Thank you, ACSONI, JOINHER, for hosting me. Again, I was a little saddened that the esteemed colleague of mine, Professor Mafundikwa, was not able to join us because we had framed this to be a dialogue in many ways. And so his unanticipated absence has changed the framing of what I'm going to talk about. Not too much, a little bit. I'll have to adjust what it is that I'm going to be talking about to cover some aspects that Ngara was going to cover in his contribution. But again, nonetheless, this is not a major issue, as I know Ngara will be here, and I'll join him for this conversation. I would like to share my screen. Okay, I was playing Bavarira, the song that you see there, but that's not what I'm gonna share. I'm gonna share some slides. This is what I want to share. Also, I'm trying to minimize us so that you can see the screen. I can also see my own screen. Right, so my talk today is going to revolve around what I conceptualize is states of disarmament, which is a reading of state making in African recent history. I'll define these terms maybe now and as I go. I was holding a copy of my book earlier before we started. I have this copy on here. You can hear the sonics. Maybe you can't see it now. So this book was published in 2015. The title of that book is African Music, Power and Being in Colonial Zimbabwe, published by Indiana Invest Press. It is a book that a lot of my colleagues, a lot of my friends, many people understand as a book on African and Zimbabwean, Southern African musical cultures. It's true, but that's the first reading. I don't want to say superficial, because that reading is correct, but there's a deeper reading. It's to me, what I was attempting to do with that book, it was to diagnose our states of being, so that the musical cultures and arts are just a vista. It's a window to look into these states of being, which are basically states of disarmament. When I say disarmament, if you think in military terms, this is really the removal of that which protects, the protective armor. And in this work, in a lot of my work, this book and others that I'll talk about maybe briefly, this disarmament is cultural, first and foremost. When you think about things like colonization, we really tend to think about the military conquests and occupation and subjugation. But what I'm arguing in my work, starting with this foundational book, is that conquest and military subjugation are important, but they are not the most important weapons and instruments of oppression and subjugation. The first and foremost is the cultural dimension of things. Because once you've stormed the fortresses, the cultural fortresses of a people, it becomes very, very difficult for those people to remain themselves, to resist in any consistent way, in any unified way, in any conscious way, because cultural conquest hits at the core of the consciousness of people's self-understanding. So this is, in many ways, the core of the argument that I make in this book. And in subsequent books, I do grapple with this problem of us as an African people, doesn't matter where, have been subjugated in this way. We've been disarmed. So that is the problem. That's the diagnosis of the problem. Then you should look for solutions with a full understanding of that situation. So my second book that is upcoming is called Chimurenga, Afrosonic Making of Zimbabwe, the Military Entertainment Complex. I also research and write about tools and technologies of colonization and self-liberation, such as radio broadcasting, which was used as a tool to re-engineer our minds, to re-engineer our sensorium as a people, to determine and change what we tell each other about the world, our knowledge systems, what we think we understand, and what we hear. All that is very, very important. We take radio for granted these days, but this is a work that talks about how radio came. Is that one of those insidious weaponries? Then my most important latter work that's ongoing is on the Zimbabwean and Southern African and broadly African wars of self-liberation since the 1960s. But also work that has been in progress for a long time, titled for now, Muchecheterwa Chiwashira, an inspired autobiography of my great ancestor chief. I was playing that song at the beginning in Bavarira, the song of Chiwashira's song. It's a song that is played whenever my people, chiefs in my clan are being enthroned. So it is a deeply historical song that's associated mainly with Chiwashira. But I'll circle back a bit more to frame the problem that really we should really see as an opening to what I call the post-colonial psychosonic disorders as our main or indicator of our state of being. And so I often like to start the story with this image here of the young girl, Rutendo Ngadile Nyoni. Was a high school student when I met her in 2014 in Harare. You can see she's dressed in school uniform. So two things are important there. And in that image, she's dressed in school uniform and she's holding Mbira, which is the epitome of our Zimbabwean and African metallurgical and sonic engineering, more than 1,000 years old, invented by our ancestors. And I was holding that instrument, and she asked me when I met her if I taught that instrument. I said, well, I don't teach it. I'm also kind of learning, but I basically play with it. Well, Tendo told me a story, how a mother smashed her own instrument because she used to own one. And so she was really burning inside to acquire a different one and keep it safely and away from her mother, who would still destroy it. But she was adamant that she would never stop playing the instrument that the ancestors made centuries ago. So the two things for me here to understand the African condition, the African cultures, but also the place of the school brought out in this image. And I'll be talking about these two things at some level today. But I also opened the book with this passage. Yeah, that's on the screen, and I'll read the first paragraph. So, writing about a childhood in 1960s Buera, in rural colonial Zimbabwe, Sekai Nzenza in the middle there, reminisced about how one Christmas Eve, a mother instructed her and her siblings to look out for a local Anglican priest, Babam Temarari. Once they spotted him coming, she instructed them to hide everything that was unchristian around the village compound. We covered 2 big pots of the highly potent manga beer under sacks and blankets, then closed the kitchen hut. My brother Charles dragged our famous drum, Ngoma, called Zino Irema, and hid that in the granary. My father reluctantly switched off his Mahlatini, the Mautela Queen's music, and hid the gramophone in the bedroom. In many ways, this is also the epitome of what I'm talking about here, the cultural disarmament and internalization of the cultures that came to criminalize, to demonize, and to confuse and bewilder the African. Another story, another anecdote is, I'm sure some of you remember when Peter Jones died on April 27th in 2020. And one of the reports on his death was some kind of biographical take on his significance. And so one journalist wrote that more often than not, PJ would connect Zimbabwe to the world, playing latest music as it happens on Billboard UK Top 40 and what have you. During those days, it was rare to get latest music, and many would see PJ collecting his bag of latest hits at the airport. The airport. What is an airport in our cultural imaginary, in our place in the world, and in our cultural sensorium? Something to reflect on. However, his critics were quick to blame PJ for focusing more on foreign music than local. But whichever way you look at it, the history of Zimbabwean radio would not be complete without mentioning PJ, your DJ. A story that we can spend the whole day talking about, but I just wanted to put it up there and hopefully have conversations about that. So all these stories and others that populate this book try to diagnose what I conceptualize as the Shuramatongo as a condition of African ruination. Shuramatongo is what Walter Rodney called underdevelopment. And it defines underdevelopment as a state of being that does not mean the absence of development, but a regressive product of plunder, enslavement, colonialism, neocolonialism, and extroversion. Now, this state of being when you're living like where you are does not belong to you. That space. You're always living with a glance over your shoulder. Is it somebody's gonna come and repossess that space where you are? That's extroversion. And you're also looking sideways to receive and to take, to assimilate, to open the door, to open the mind to things that come, to destabilize your world and redefine it for you. Writing about something similar, Mainawa Kinyathi, in his book, History of Resistance in Kenya, tells us that after the British takeover, colonialism itself, not nature, frustrated our further development as a people. This is very, very important because, I mean, the idea of development is so intoxicating. There are programs in universities and schools, and there are NGOs and think tanks, and, well, think tanks, but more tank than think, if you really think about it, which deal with the idea of development, sponsor the idea of development, sponsor what they call development, but is it actually development? There is something that's deeper than when we talk about development, we tend to think about the macroeconomics of things. But here, again, with Walter Rodney, I'm very much interested in something that underlies and subverts all our efforts to do what we think we are doing when we say development, which is psychological underdevelopment. And Rodney wrote that any diagnosis of underdevelopment in Africa will reveal not just low per capita income and protein deficiencies, but also the gentlemen who dance in Abidjan, Accra, and in Kinshasa, when music is played in Paris, London, and New York. This is the cultural fortress that's been destroyed. You can think about the cultural impoverishment, the poverty of our artists, when millions are drained, when we dance to other people's musics but our own, we are basically draining the wealth that should belong to us culturally. If you look at those people who sponsor the idea of development as something that comes from outside, people like John Iliff, a professor of African history at Cambridge University, He tells us that poverty was an aboriginal condition in Africa, a structural, primordial existence, and colonialism came to cure that. Colonialism is a good thing that came to solve the problem of development and poverty in Africa. He goes on to tell us that Africa's splendor lies in its suffering. The heroism in African history is found not in the deeds of kings, but in the struggles of ordinary people against the forces of nature and the cruelty of men. And he says, likewise, the most noble European activities in Africa have been those often now forgotten, who have cared for the sick and starving and homeless. This is a European teacher of African history telling us that colonization and colonialism are good things. This is an example of what Professor Paul Tiambe-Zeleza in his book, The Manufacturing of African Studies and Crises, calls the 9 lives of imperialist historiography. Scholarship is not just fun. It is not harmless. It is not just pointless writing, you know. It is really the foundation for policy. And these are people who are contracted by policymakers, by NGOs, by think tanks, by governments to advise policies for the African continent, for African people who write like this. This is the Colonial Library. This is the Global Library. This book you find everywhere, read by African students. What are they being taught? Right. My reading of the African condition is psychological underdevelopment. Demystifies what Eilif and others try to lie to us as the causes of African poverty or impoverishment. So in a lot of my work, I read what missionaries were doing. The activities of those people who supposedly cared for the sick and starving and homeless. These are the activities of Europeans. Were they actually doing that? If you read writings by missionaries like this newspaper, I don't know if you are aware that there was a newspaper like this one called the Kefa Express. As you all know, Kefa is the N-word in Southern Africa and on the continent. These are missionaries writing in 1871, Europeans coming to Africa to do what? My argument, to subvert Africans through African cultures. So this is missionaries basically producing blueprints of African impoverishment, in other words. And this is one guy who wrote that there was something called the Native Department or Native Affairs Department, which was the colonial department in most countries on the continent that was mandated to deal with Africans and deal in its all senses. And before the Native Department was even established in 1871, this guy was writing to the missionary-run newspaper published at Lovedale Mission Station in South Africa that we must establish a Native Department. And to do what? And he says, this guy is called himself, signed off as a colonist. The Native Department, assisted by missionaries, is decidedly the only safe stepping stone for us in dealing with the natives. Otherwise, all our efforts in dealing with the present objectionable native customs and amusements will recoil upon us. Okay, why did African cultures offend them? That's one of the key questions. A colonist goes on, it is evident that we must secure the services of missionaries, and we must allow them to some extent to take the lead. By their teaching and influence, the Kefa must be kindly and gradually won from barbarism and heathenism to civilization and Christianity. And when he has reached this latter stage, then the Kafir himself will only too gladly and willingly seek to be subject to the same laws and the regulations which govern a civilized community. In other words, what a colonist is saying, Africans will only be too happy to be ruled by the white man, to be a subject of alien governance. Once we've stormed his cultural fortress, once we've removed his customs, what it is that he amuses himself with, his religions, his spiritualities, then he's ours. So a few decades, like 20 years after this letter, we have exactly what a colonist is suggesting here in Zimbabwe, what becomes Southern Rhodesia, maybe a decade in South Africa. And Europeans knew what they were doing. This is the butcher of the Congo, Leopold II, who killed more than 10 million Africans in his civilizing mission. These folks were deploying. They were deploying the church. And in this letter that he wrote to the missionaries in Belgium in 1883, he is basically doing the very same thing that people like colonists are doing from Lovedale, that we must take away and destroy African cultures. We must destroy those cultures that prevent us from conquering them. That spirituality, which is a threat to our conquest, we must remove. So go and demonize. Make, and I'm quoting here, by all means, the Negro must be made Christian. By only this way will they let go of their rich culture and everything they respect about themselves. You can see that Europeans, foregrounding the work of missionaries, were basically re-engineering Africans and producing the kind of African that in many ways we have become over the decades. You see that in the writings of regular Europeans, missionaries, but also soldiers in the colonial wars of conquest. This is Baden-Powell, Robert Baden-Powell, who wrote in his book, The Matabele Campaign, that even when the present force, Baden-Powell was a colonial soldier in the Matopo, Matomboko in Western Zimbabwe, where he was killing people, targeting spirit mediums for Rhodes BSA company. So, and he wrote his mother, he was writing his mother in England, even when the present force has broken up the impies in the field and cleared their strongholds out, there will remain a tail of work for local police to do in carrying out disarmament. So the European colonizer was interested in disarming Africans militarily, but also culturally and spiritually, as Baden-Powell understood. The doses being given, though bitter now, they are better then. When is then? In the future. The gratuitous violence seems the only way to get these men to understand there's a greater power than the Yamlimo. And once the lesson has been unmistakably brought home to them, there is some hope that a time of peace and permanence may dawn for them. Two-pronged process of state-making. What is state-making? We tend to think about state in the sense of governing structure, making up a country. But I'm talking about the mind here. To make a state is to produce subjects of power. This is how Africans were being produced into subjects of the colonial system through military and cultural re-engineering. This is Baden-Powell again. I'm sure many of you have seen this photograph doing the rounds on the internet. This is Baden-Powell's sketch in his notebook, which he called the Christmas tree. And this is how Christmas came to Africans. We're in October. Christmas is coming. Many Africans are preparing for Christmas now. You see a Christmas tree in their homes. To Baden-Powell, this is what it means. And today, if you really look at what we call Christmas, it's the same thing. I'm not inventing anything here. Baden-Powell wrote all these things, including in this book, the early campaigns, the Matabele campaign, 1896, and the downfall of Prembe in West Africa, a diary of life with the native levy in Ashandi, 1895 to 1896. I don't know how many of us know that as Baden-Powell was destroying shrines and killing spirit mediums, he was also taking African cultural artifacts, such as Nonzo Yenyika, that walking stick, if you want, the scepter that Mukwati used, one of the prime spirit mediums in the Zimbabwean resistance. He took it to England, and it was only returned in 1997, recovered from Baden-Powell's grandson by spirit medium Matosi. It is in Harare today. And Baden-Powell lies buried in Nyeri. I saw his grave. I walked on his grave last August. So there was a deep understanding of what the colonial state was doing and working with the missionaries. Today we get the easy statistics that 40%, or if you want, I mean, all the way to 80% of Africans are Christians. How did Africans become Christians? And what does it actually mean to be Christian as an African? This is Cecil John Rhodes writing in 1898. This class, I think, is better than policemen and cheaper. This class, the missionaries. Missionaries as mercenaries of empire. This is why even today in Zimbabwe, after the land reclamation of 2000, the church owns thousands of hectares of land today that John Rhodes gave to them as part of this mission to go destroy the native, deploying the church in the midst of Africans. And today, where does Rhodes lie buried? At the core of African spirituality and cosmology, right there at Matombo in Western Zimbabwe, where Baden-Powell was destroying our shrines. So what is happening here is a spiritual conquest and the defilement, the mortuary defilement of African sacred spaces and epistemes. There is a place where is buried basically is, if you look at the map of the tourism authority in Zimbabwe, it's called the World's View. It's supposed to be a tourist space. What's the difference between tourism and terrorism? Again, I'm not inventing this. This is an artwork that these guys sketched of themselves. This is the American mercenary Frederick Burnham and Baden-Powell, the same one, as they tracked and murdered African spirit mediums in Matombo to clear the project of military and spiritual disarmament. So the key agenda behind destroying African sacred sites was really to prevent African self-reproduction in their own image. according to their own worldviews. What is an image? So do you, when you take a photograph of yourself, do you see somebody else when you print that photo? You see yourself. You have reproduced yourself. So in terms of living self-reproduction, you're supposed to continue in perpetuity as a people. But the missionary project and the colonial project was about undermining and cutting that process, which is why these missionaries and the colonial system also targeted the African living species and self-reproduction species, such as the cooking species, what you call the kitchen today. This is one missionary writing in 1893 in the very same Cafe Express. All around them was the great mass of heathenism. The air was full of heathen songs and sounds and the vision of heathen sites and customs. The environments were entirely hostile to the growth of the Christian character. The fathers and mothers did not know how to save their children from the contamination of their surroundings. A worker in the slums of London says, "You cannot raise angels in pigsties." So this is the African home. Hopefully at the end, I will be able to talk about how a lot of our cultural workers have been able to read and redeploy these species for African rearmament, including in the diaspora. But we have got to understand the destruction or the destructive design first. And I took this image here in a 2014 National Gallery of Zimbabwe exhibition by my colleague who is not here, Sakima Fundikwa. The kitchen was a space for gendered socialization. It was a space of birth and life rituals. It was a shrine for death and afterlife rituals. That's why we hold bira ceremonies in there to call the ancestors into the home. This is where naming ceremonies are conducted. This is where children, soon after they are born, they are cooked. They're washed in herbs to fortify them against the evils of the world, to give them an identity. When they fall sick, they are treated in that space. They eat healthy cultural food in that space. It's the space of the ancestors. When they die, they spend the night lying instead on the rukuva behind where we were standing there. And from rukuva, they go to be buried in the guva, straight to the grave, from the shrine to the grave. The grave itself becomes a shrine. It's an extension of the African socialization space and sacred space. These are the spaces that missionaries in the colonial state were demonizing to subvert African self-reproduction. This was the school also. I'll read this passage that I often read, again, to illustrate the depth of the demonization. This is one missionary going to Zambia. And he wrote this in the Zambezi Mission Record, the Jesuit publication that was run from Chishawasha Mission. It's 1915. I was camped for the night within half a mile of a large native kraal. It was in the middle of the rainy season. That year, the rains were far below the average, and a dance was held that night to propitiate the evil spirits that were causing the drought. I don't know if the drought here in California is caused by evil spirits. The dance started at sunset and lasted till sunrise, with continuous accompaniment of tom-toms. What things are called is important. What are tom-toms? The night was sultry and sleep was fitful. Whenever I woke, I could hear the unceasing sounding of the drum. The yelling and stamping was always going on with the same vigor. There was one voice that could be clearly distinguished from the others. I heard it at practically every hour between sunset and sunrise. I was told the drama is generally a specialist and that the same performer goes on from the beginning to the end of the dance. A rough estimate gave for that night well over 500,000 beats of the tom-tom. This guy was supposedly counting the number of beats on the ngoma. And as he wrote later on, don't ask them to do your work, how lazy they are. So all this was wasted energy that the colonial state and missionaries must harness. For what purpose? For colonial profit. Missionaries attacked the heart of the Zimbabwe civilization in spirituality, just as they attacked the African homes, spaces of self-reproduction. At this very same time, as Professor Shadrach Chirikure illustrates in his book on Great Zimbabwe, colonial historians were trying to steal these very same places as civilizations that were not or did not originate from Africans. That the Great Zimbabwe, so-called, was not an African achievement, but a product of some lost white tribe or whoever, but not Africans. So this is Miss Law, the wife of a missionary, writing from the Zimbabwe in 1894, again writing in the Kefa Express, now called Christian Express. Yesterday, we too, Mr. Law and myself, walked to Zimbabwe, which is about 4 miles distant from here. I believe the general idea is that it was once a large heathen temple. It does really look like it. And if it is, the thought came to me, how glad we should be that God has honored us to send us to perform the true God almost on the very place where once the grossest idolatry was practiced. They were setting up Morgenster mission, which produced many, many Zimbabweans, many teachers, many evangelists. Many people are very, very proud of that mission station to the present. This is how it was produced, and this is the purpose for which it was produced. And as I indicated, these people were burying themselves right there on these sacred spaces where they were claiming were spaces of idolatry. This is Alan Wilson's first grave. I don't know if you guys have gone through the Great Zimbabwe, seen this grave right close to the museum before it was moved to Matopo after Rhodes was buried there in 1902. Why were they burying themselves on our sacred spaces? If you have been to Matopo, you have also seen this edifice that commemorates brave men, Alan Wilson and his settler column, which was decimated by Lobengula's troops in 1893. They were brave men, we are told. This is how these spaces were being cleared for colonial monumentalization. All these African functionaries were arrested, being killed, stripped naked, put in jail in leg irons, hung, demonized. Reign functionaries, priests, Makombre. This was the design. This is what we have. This is the outcome. So when all these allies and others write about religion in Africa, this story, this background story, is never heard. This is how African became Christian. This is how African became Islamic, through bullets, Bibles, and Qurans. This is how Africans became Christian. When the men were killed during and after the colonial invasion wars, these African children were now orphans. These are African mothers and women who have now become orphans and widows. And look at the missionaries there, the stepfathers. They stepped in to take the place of African men in African self-reproduction. They call themselves father. That's what they meant. Took this to, I got this image from the National Archives in Zimbabwe. You can see the caption there says, starving Matabele women and children at a Hope Fountain. It was not an accident that the missionaries called their mission stations these crows where they put Africans like animals, that they named them with names like that. What was the hope? Whose hope? What was this audacity? Hope Fountain, the fountain of hope. Who was hoping for what? This became the first crop of African mass conversion. After the wars, I'm reading tons and tons of colonial documents on the anti-colonial war of 1893 and 96, 97. These are the images. After those wars, after Africans surrendered or were defeated, they continued to destroy African homes and burn down African granaries and farms and fields and food crops to produce this wretchedness that you see in this image. To deliver these Africans, the caption to say, well, these wretches were given to the mission stations to be fed. You don't hear that they destroyed African homes and food crops and granaries, and they chased these people for months in the forests, and they raped them in post-war reprisals. This is, in many ways, the story of the NGO today. This is what Professor Mhoze has called criminal humanitarianism. This is its origins. NGOs are not there to build African capacity. They are there to subvert it. Because they are not NGOs even. They are governmental organizations. Which governments? Not ours. Okay, I will not bore you with the details, but this about the post-war reprisals, again targeting Kaguvi and Nyanda, which is what they called Nehanda. Because as long as Kaguvi and Nehanda were alive, there'll be no peace in this land. But again, what is peace? And again, the story of the missionary, Father Bila there, the key missionary at Shawasha, it suggested that, well, you need to destroy these people's food if you are going to get these people. This is from back a religion chronicler. And that's exactly what they did. Killed these spirit mediums, destroyed people's food, took the children to the mission stations. And right there, I've got this photo in my book. You can see how the little African children there are parading in white dresses and shirts, actually blouses. Those boys are wearing blouses, as the text says. Neander's children, when she was murdered, were taken to Shawasha mission right there, kicking and screaming. And she was traumatized. People went to see her there, tell the stories of how traumatized she was. She had seen her parents, their whole family destroyed and killed. And she was taken by force to the mission station like many, many others. And this photo illustrates a lot of dynamics about how the church and the school, because they were one and the same thing, came out of our lands. as instruments of epistemicide. I often remark about those people who are sitting on the margins, who are not quite part of those parading so-called civilization, but they are close by. By and by, they're getting in, they're being absorbed, they're being co-opted. They are not sure they are reading this alien institution that has come onto our land. They want to see what is happening there. The stories that they hear from their children when they come from the mission. Sometimes they come during days of festivity to see for themselves. Sugar, sweets, and things are being doled out. This is how African identities are being produced as shameful. Those heathens on the margins. And those who are dressed in uniform, church and school uniform, are celebrated. This is epistemicide, destruction of African worldviews and knowledge systems. This is the story of Neander's child. He was renamed from Makandi Pay when she was taken to the mission, renamed Mary Ann. What does naming signify? Today, we've got millions of Mary Anns running around the continent. Thinking again through the sonic musical vista, that mbira is not there. It's not one of those instruments that those African youngsters are holding and playing in that stacked photo there. It's about sonic disarmament, because mbira is a very, very important cultural instrument. It calls the ancestors into those spaces that I talked about, the spaces of self-reproduction. They were being disarmed. Sonic re-engineering. Now these children were taught, now over the decades, they became fellow creatures. Because initially they were creature fellows. This is Andrew Hartman writing in the Zambezi mission record in 1903. And Hartman, that name rings a bell. Hartman House, one of those schools that rich Africans in Zimbabwe take their children to. What is the agenda in the colonial education policy? I discussed that at length in chapter 1 of this book, to re-engineer them from being who they are, to become colonial subjects. You hit the mind. And again, this was not an accident. There was clear wisdom in what the missionaries in the colonial state were doing. As one missionary wrote in his Zambezi mission record in July 1905, if the people of Africa are to be brought to a knowledge of the love of God, it must be through the instrumentality of their own children. They were targeting African children. They were targeting the African future. Another told the Commission of Native Education in 1925 that our great object in building schools was evangelizing the native. When I first came to Southern Rhodesia, I walked from crow to crow and found it useless until we started schools. Start with the children. This is cultural genocide. This is why, again, we have all these big mission stations that have remained famous to the present. This photo was taken at Kutama Mission. Maybe one of those little ones. Your guess is as good as mine. Which one is the great Robert Mugabe there? What are they doing there? They are singing from hymns and blowing these westernized instruments. This is what Mugabe said about these spaces. We lived in Christian villages. We were born there and no heathens, as they were called, were allowed in. Our grannies were heathens outside. We were not allowed to go out. So what the missionaries and the government did was to construct what they called Christian villages around these mission stations, separating them from what they called pagan villages, those Africans who refused this agenda of death. They were demonized, ostracized as heathens. And one missionary wrote, some pagan families were still to be found in the Christian villages. A little firmness has proved sufficient to make them move to separate pagan crops. What is a little firmness? Dogs and whips, destruction of homes. And how do they determine that this one was pagan and this one was Christian? You are found playing your tom-tom there, or calling your ancestors, or playing imbira. You're in trouble. As Stella Chiweshe told me in 2012, she grew up in Mondoro. We were instructed to run and report our parents and neighbors to the priest at St. Marco's Mission whenever we saw them playing imbira, ngoma and osho. They are Satan's people, we were told. The destruction of the African family, the weaponization of the African child, the use of sound instruments. So by the 1930s, this agenda had produced the results. Because in one of the chapters in the book, I talk about how these African converts pressured the European, because the Europeans and Africans belong to different mission bodies. So the native Christians prevailed on their white counterparts to push the state to investigate what they called evil night dances that were happening around the country. And the whole nationwide investigation was conducted. Reports coming from all kinds of places about how the missionaries, the native commissioners, the location superintendents, African chiefs, and others had done to repress, to destroy these evil night dances. These Africans going about their own cultures, enjoying themselves. This is how, a lot of musicians today, if you ask them in Zimbabwe and elsewhere, how they became musicians. I grew up singing in the church choir, in the school choir. This became the authorized register. You stand like that, you're singing in these tonic sofas. You are singing Jesus now. A lot of my colleagues look at spaces like Mhoze, those who have been to Mbare. Mhoze became a very important cultural space in the colonial reserves called locations, what I call dislocations, spaces where Africans were dislocated to when their lands were taken by force and violence. And when these Africans were coming from the mission schools, now grown, they've imbibed these mission ideas. Where do they spend their Sunday, that day of the week when they are not working for the colonial exploiter? Mhoze, Stanley War, Blawa, performing these healthy entertainments, civilized Christian entertainments. What you don't see in a lot of people who romanticize these spaces is how these spaces basically represent they represent suppressed memories. They are spaces for the recreation of the subjugated African. And who was Mhoze? Neander's niece, the very same Medad Neander's niece. One of those were taken Shawsha mission. Now became a Catholic model and agent of Catholicism deployed back to her own people to continue the colonial agenda. And Sonia Yugushini, this again white professor of African history, tells us that Mhoze was one of the leaders in the origins of African feminism in Zimbabwe. This celebration without reflection. This is the late Abel Snamesi Stole, fighter for the War of Liberation in ZAPU, one of the two people on the face of my book. These recreation wars, as they were called, should really be called recreation with that stroke there. What was being recreated there, a particular kind of African subject. So that day of the week when you're not working for the colonist as a domestic worker or in the factory doing cheapened labor, you're supposed to expend all your political energies and anger in these controlled spaces, where you're given colonial awards for being the best behaved native. The idea was that we were making the lazy native work, that one who beats 500 beats of the tom-tom. Now it's taken there to work, but it's not enough to teach the native the dignity of labor, as they called it. We must also teach them to play, and to play healthfully. That is civilized entertainment, not those native amusements that the colonist was denigrating in the 1870s. What has happened here? This is a process of re-engineering of African consciousness and reduction of Africans into equipment for colonial profit. And African cultures are very, very important instrument to weaponize in this regard. These infrastructures were also built. How were they built? Again, I was involved in some debate with one of my colleagues in the University of Zimbabwe. Was saying, but the colonial governments built us all these spaces. Now our governments are neglecting them. Okay. Do we actually understand these urban spaces that we are very proud of? These colonial service centers and these colonial reserves in the city. These were built through what the municipalities called the Kefa Beer Fund. This was colonization on the cheap. Africans brewed their beer for millennia. When the colonizers came, they took it. They forbid Africans from producing and drinking it as they wanted. Now the colonial municipalities mass-produced it and sold it to Africans for their own profit. That's the man that was used to build these structures to further subjugate Africans. It's architectures of control. Okay, I think I'm going to end here, but with just a few words to say, Africans never gave up their cultures. Africans continue to resist. Africans never said we have been defeated. By the 1950s, 1970s, again, you can see how the very same demonized cultures are brought to spaces of entertainment, which was more than entertainment. There's a photo of Mkanya there, Thomas Mapfumo, dressed like a Shikiro, a spirit medium, on stage. Look at that Ghana that is holding there. The message is never stopped. So part of what I do in my work and in this book is to historicize the idea of these cultures of resistance against this assault. Africans continued to exercise their cultural sovereignty, even though it was attacked. Because as Ahmed Sékou Touré wrote in 1969, for us to speak of culture is to fight. And have chosen to carry the data of this combat forward into the present era. This is the logic that underlies my upcoming book, Chimurenga Afrosonicity. The cultures of resistance, the Chimurenga music that Mapfumo and others are known for, as a foundation for African self-liberation and for the building of the new nation states that we have today. This is what I wanted to talk about initially. People like John Mapondera, for example, did significant work in the diaspora, utilizing these very same demonized African cultures to give Africans who were scattered and displaced in these jungles their voice. They basically, because they grew up in the African context, they took the very same African spaces, the yard, the kitchen, the African homestead, and used that to frame African theater in the UK, for example. And by doing that, they were basically modeling independent Africa, independent Zimbabwe. This is how Mapondera, for example, brought the idea of the culture house. That's how he built the Mrewa Culture Center as the prototype of what he was doing countrywide, part of what he was modeling in the UK with his work with drum, an African-led and owned centered NGO that he led. Inviting African cultural producers and thinkers and scholars like Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Ola from Nigeria and a lot of others, because Africans in the world during the colonial period were demonized and were marginalized. And what was the diagnosis? Well, because your cultures and your being have been demonized, you become nothing, you're seen as nothing. This is part of the larger agenda. So how do we come back from this assault? Let's insist on our humanity, utilizing our cultures to rearm ourselves in the same way that these cultures basically became a mobilizing weapon for the armed struggles that would start in the 1960s. That's why Chimurenga music became so important to mobilize people who went to fight, to train as guerrillas in the camps where I'm currently going to speak with folks, but also to gather materials to tell that story of African self-liberation. But it's a story that you can trace back even to the mission station, where those children who were dragged, kicking and screaming, never gave up. They were singing songs in their own African languages, such as Vanawedu Anochema. Our children cry, they mourn for the death of Africa. This is in the 1920s. What Lana Mataka, one late musician, sang to me in the 2000s. They saw colonization as death, the death of Africa. And they were mourning the death of Africa, not celebrating colonization as a civilization or a civilizing mission. This is another song that Mbuya Mlambo, the late, sang for me in 2000. These children were mourning the poverty of their fathers. And how did they diagnose that poverty? Their country, their lands were taken. Their freedom, their sovereignty were taken by the kneeless ones. They are kneeless because they don't bend down to do their own chores, not because they wore trousers. So songs like this help us to imagine the African psyche back in the day, 1930s. They were singing right there, the mission stations. Tinorwa, we fight. We fight for a country taken by the Boers. We fight. This is my father's song. Whoa, because when my great ancestor was killed, and his head is right there in the museums of London as we speak today. They formed, the name was banned. That's why I'm called Chikowero Day. Chikowero was Chwashira's father. And so they still formed the choir using the very same authorized register, Chwashira Brothers Choir at Kwenda Mission in the 1950s. And what were they singing? the story of the destruction of Africa through enslavement and colonization. Our ancestors were taken those many centuries ago by the Arabs, by the whites, how they were alienated and taken away to the faraway lands, America, where they were sold like chicken and cattle because they were not seen as humans. And they would place one person at the corner of the building as they sang these songs to see if the missionary, who was also in many cases happened to be the headmaster, was coming. This was resistance in tight corners. These are some of my, well, now all that. The last one, close to my brother there in black, passed away 3 weeks ago. It was the last of my fathers, the Chikowero brothers choir. Okay, I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that absolutely riveting journey. I am still taking it all in. I thought I knew my fair bit of history, but you have once again proven that every day is an opportunity for learning new things, as well as reinforcing the knowledge that was lost. So we thank you from the bottom of our hearts and intellects for this absolutely insightful presentation. I would like to invite Laurie just to comment before we invite any of our participants to field some questions. Please don't feel intimidated to ask the professor questions. I am lucky enough in my life experience to be able to call the professor a friend. And so I promise you that he will answer all your questions with the greatest of sensitivities. So please, I would urge you all to loosen up your vocal cords or your fingers and type some questions in there. Laurie, I'll hand over to you for now.
Thanks, Nat.
Well, Professor, the other day when we had the initial conversation, I didn't know you were going to deliver this. This is worthy of a lecture in a history, in a historical context for students who perhaps are studying history. Because I think one of the key things as I was listening, we're all quite aware of our European history to the point where we perhaps understand even as far back as the medieval England sort of time. Because when you're talking about some of the elements of what you're talking about, which is happening on the African continent throughout, there's a lot of things that are symbolic. The use of faith, you know, the whole idea of Christianity. We see so many movies and books and reenactment about trying to get rid of witches and wizards and so on and so forth, and burning people at the stake and so on and so forth. So there's quite a lot of this that echoes. But I think listening to everything just brings it into full circle. And I think one of the things you were talking about, and I appreciate what you see when you said the word image. You know, it's not just image. And I think it would be wonderful if you could explain to everyone that there's an expression that you have for the word image, where you said I, and then you imagine that. I think it would be very insightful for you to explain that, because I think your work allows people to perhaps look at themselves differently, especially when they understand how you view image. So could you explain that image, how you have now changed that and what you're using with that with your students?
Thanks, Maswan. Yeah, there is often that shadow that is cast over us when stories of the violence of religions is told in Europe. But also out of that came what? came the so-called Enlightenment. And a lot of African scholars and scholars of Africa would teach Africans. They teach the Enlightenment story as a project that missionaries brought to Africa. But what Enlightenment are they bringing to Africa? The very same violence that they'd undertaken in Europe and West. So that what we call Enlightenment, what they call Enlightenment, that's their definition. To us, it was endarkenment. That's why they produced the image of Africa as a dark continent. They imagined that, they produced that through the kinds of images that they sketched of Africa. Africa is a place of lack, it's a place of violence. The slave trade, as they write, so made Africans so depraved that they began to eat each other. You must go there to civilize them. The agency and the subject of that violence is distorted in how things are framed and defined. We are told about the slave trade. Who were the enslavers? The very same people were supposed to be civilizing Africans. And Christianity is supposed now to enlighten Africans. But what is, you don't enlighten people with light. You don't illuminate light. You have got to have blown out the light in order to light it again. You don't empower people who have got their own power. You must have done something to deprive those people of their power in the first place. So NGOs that talk about empowerment, they're doing exactly the opposite, and they're not diagnosing why and where African power went to. Which is why, again, I always insist on our own definition of things for ourselves. Because self-reproduction, which can mean many things, the Liberation Project, for example, is only a process that is supposed to produce and project us in the world. That's how I use the idea of image. Thanks for asking that. It is I and I, as the African and Rastafarian thinkers put it. It's I and I. It's the I image. I'm imagining the world, I'm producing the world in my own image. It's I and I in the communitarian African philosophical framing. I and I does not mean me, I and myself. No. It's a communitarian brethren imagination of the self in the world, and the harmony and amity that we define in African context as UNU. Thank you. I don't want to go on, but I hope I have answered you.
We can listen to you indeterminately, Professor. Thank you so much. I have a couple of questions from one of our attendees here. I'll start with the first one, if you don't mind. First of all, the attendee is actually the chairman of the African Caribbean Support Organization here in Northern Ireland. And he first of all says thank you to the professor. Really appreciate this presentation. Question one, can he comment a little on the significance of Walter Rodney's publication, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa? And question two, do you have any comment on the contribution of Marcus Mosiah Garvey for the prioritizing and respect of African identity?
Thank you very much. I wish you had told me the name of the esteemed leader there. But
my apologies. It is simply, I'm overwhelmed by the information coming through. Sorry, his name is Dr. Good Lord. His name is Dr. Livingston Thompson.
Oh.
That is our chairman. Sorry, I just went blank for a second there. I'm sure I'm going to get fired for that one.
My apologies for putting you on the spot, Nyat. I know you can get destabilized when you are thinking many things, but
That's fine. I'm sure he'll forgive me.
he should forgive you. Thank you, Dr. Livingston. The work of Dr. Rodney is very, very significant. It's people like him and others that are the scatterings of Africa that were trying, some of us who are children on this journey, trying to emulate and use as a pedestal to think through the predicament of scattered and disarmed people. We're still fighting the war for rearmament. We've not won that war. We think we have. No, we haven't. So I think with him, what he calls underdevelopment goes to the heart of what we misunderstand when we talk about ourselves and our countries today as the developing world. In his introduction, I've got a copy of his book there. He talks about the idea of development, of underdevelopment. That development, as we know it, as it is postulated in the so-called first world, the world that enriched and developed itself through plundering the world that then became underdeveloped. There are two sides of the same coin. If you look at the foundations of these lands, the Americas and Europe, the store of the so-called Industrial Revolution, the energy for that is African energy. It is African labor, which is enforced labor, cheapened labor. It is the labor of Africans on the continent who are forced to produce all these things that are taken through unequal exchange and unwilling exchange and just confiscation on the continent. That is the whole idea of underdevelopment. It is a regressive situation, a regressive movement. It is not an original condition of being underdeveloped. There is no undeveloped state, there is no undeveloped country. It is a negative response to exploitation, the draining of resources, the draining of energy, like open veins on a body. As one Latin American scholar wrote about rail lines that many Africans mistake for development. The colonists build rail lines, they build this, they build that. All these are leading outwards. They are not internally integrated to promote African production and self-reliance. They are draining things from the continent to the ports. Is that development? No, that is underdevelopment. And so if you cast that in the Zimbabwean register, as we all must do, must think together, that is Shuramatongo. What is Dongo? Dongo is a destroyed, a ruined home. And when there's a particular snake that is believed that when you see, it's portending ruination. And people say, okay, something is going to happen. Somebody's going to die in this family. Don't see this snake ordinarily. So when something like the HIV virus is unleashed on a people, that is Shuramatongo. That's why HIV is also called Shuramatongo. So when the missionary came to the African continent, it came as Shuramatongo. a project of ruination. That's why our homes where these children were being snatched away from. That's why even we followed in the same footsteps. When you go to these colonial schools, we never go back to our homes that produced us. We are continuing the project of producing matongo, ruination. That is under development. We are not plugging the open veins, which is why the work of our ancestors, like Marcus Mosiah Garvey, is very, very important. This was a philosophy of how to plug the open veins to stop the hemorrhage. So if today, thanks to the crisis that gave us Zoom, now we talk to each other in real time. If we harness ourselves in our energy, mental, monetary, cultural, we remember, we put ourselves limb and limb together because we're dismembered. Now we can rebuild. That is rearmament. Thank you.
Laurie, do you have anything to add to that, to comment on? Dr. Livingston says, thank you very much. Excellent response to his question there. Thank you, sir.
So if I could ask you, Professor, yeah, I know you're talking about rearmament, right? How do we safeguard the idea of our heritage? Because I think through everything you've told us that we have a history, like the young girl whose name is now changed to Marianne. And we all know significantly from a cultural perspective, we are named with purpose and your destiny is embedded in your name, especially from a cultural perspective by some of the names I've heard. Like even, you know, I think one of the names was as if to suggest I've been put in poverty. I think was it Mbuya Nehanda's daughter. Her name suggests the lacking in her life. And then only for her to be renamed Marianne is not the same thing. So that lack is further implicated by a name that doesn't even, I think it just worsens an already bad situation. So how do we then, yes, we get all of these names and yes, we have all of this supposed development and the fascinations of this being disarmed. How do we then disarm, find that unity, preserve our heritage and identity? How can we do that?
Thank you, Maswan. My mother. You are my mother.
Well, you'll have to explain this because you're calling this one Yati and you're calling me Maswanda. So they don't understand what this means, Professor. We'll have to explain that.
Thank you. So that actually maybe is the answer to your question. Thanks for coming back with the further question on that one. So today people want to trace their heritage, to trace and track their footpaths or the spoor of the sheep that scattered them. They do DNA tests. The most foolproof DNA ever is this cosmological self-understanding that we have in practice here. My mother is a Masibanda, like you. You are my mother's younger sister. That means you are my mother. This is the African self-conception of identity and belonging together. This is the story of African nation making beyond the Berlin lines and the Berlin walls that tried to further scatter us. Because if you go to Tanzania, you find a Nyati there. You find, I think there is a Mandlov here from Kenya as one of the attendees. You are going back in time. This is a blood relationship and code of relationships. If you do DNAs of these people who call themselves with a particular totem, you go back to their common ancestors. They keep this DNA in the languages, in the honorific titles, in the daily register of communication and self-understanding. So again, when I thank you, I'm not thanking Laurie. I'm thanking the ancestors that gave us you, that you represent. I'm thanking them. I'm invoking them. I'm calling them. This is Mutupo. This is Hotep. So it's the deeper self-understanding that would really help us to rearm, to bring back the armor that was stolen, that was destroyed. But you cannot destroy this inner cosmological DNA. We simply have to understand the depths of our history. People say, how do we understand this history? How do we reconstruct it now that, well, maybe there are no written records? These are the written records. This is the written record. This mbira right here. I play this mbira here. I play on here. I speak with my ancestor now. I ask her questions. Okay, the great one, how come you were overpowered by these people without knees? He tells me his story. So we underestimate our power and the knowledge systems as foundations for bringing us up again as a source for regeneration. And we saw, again, to go back to your question, we need to understand the logics of the witchcraft that missionaries cast upon us. How they crafted the African that they wanted. Because in many ways were the African that John Rhodes and others were projecting 50 years, 100 years from then. We want 9/10 of Africans to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. How do we do that? Destroy their cultures, build them schools, and do an education policy that teaches them nonsense. Just the basic errors, so that they can take instructions as messengers and cheapen the laborers. So when we celebrate the schools that missionaries built without looking at the content and the psychology, we are doing ourselves a great disservice. We've got to understand the mission. What is the mission? The destruction of Africans. We cannot build anything if you don't understand the destructive mission of ruination. Asante.
You go right to the heart of the matter, Professor, which is what we need. These are the types of conversations that are relevant. So do you believe when we're saying things like decolonization, can people become decolonized, or are we still going to have to struggle with what colonialism in its foundations created? Can we eradicate it?
So you asked something that's that goes to the heart of the predicament. I've got a couple of African graduate students. One of the problems in living in a very nice place like Santa Barbara is that the cost of living is up the ceiling. And in times like the COVID crisis, which we ill understand still, was that food impoverishment is a serious issue. It's a global problem that Africans face. And very sadly, on the continent itself, often, because it becomes so dependent on the parasites. As one of my friends, Nyashamboti, says, we are like hosts who now depend on the parasite. Now, how does that work? That's the predicament of coloniality. Because with those students, I started an Uhuru gardening project where we grow most of the food that they need in terms of vegetables, actual food, not foodstuffs, what my friend Njatika Boy from Kenya calls foodstuffs, which is most of what we eat. Toxic chemical things from the shops. That's not food, that's foodstuffs. There's more stuff in there than food. And so I was holding a tomato, one of these, our garden moments. It's also a learning space outside of the four walls. So I was holding a tomato that something had burrowed into. And I said, guys, let's look at this tomato. I think you can think about many things using this tomato as an allegory. I think it can allow us to understand colonization. So the pest goes in there, it eats, it deposits its eggs. Maybe it dies, it has done its job, it has carried out its mission. Maybe it exits, maybe it dies in there, but the eggs are there, they're gonna hatch. This thing is now self-reproducing inside something that is very good. We don't use chemicals in that garden. Maybe you are gonna eat that tomato, but the eggs are in there. What are you eating? You are eating things that are going to hatch maybe in your body. Some of these things can actually go up all the way to your brain. You end up with this disease that you really don't understand. That's how colonization really works. It gets internalized because we're reproduced and recreated in these mission schools through the witches, which is what I call the missionaries. That process was witchcrafting. We were crafted into what we are today through this vile agenda. So as products of that system, do you actually understand that this is the thing that was done to us to begin with? So the problem is how to diagnose colonialism and coloniality. Then are we the best person to now fix this problem? If a leader of your nation, a great liberation fighter, was born in a so-called Christian village, and when he's talking to you as a nation, he's busy playing with a rosary around his neck, as he left the Christian village, as the Christian village left him, the colony is now in his mind. Now, how do we decolonize? I don't know. There's a lot of decolonizing this, decolonizing that today. I tend to prefer self-liberation as a concept. But we can only do that once we understand what it is that infected us to begin with. It's an ongoing process. People like Ngugathiongo and others have written decolonizing the mind. And again, I mentioned Nyashamboti is really, with his series of books, one of the first of which is coming out now, is teaching us about the depth, but also the metamorphosis of oppression. His book series is called Apartheid Studies, subtitled A Manifesto. Mind-blowing scholarship. Colonialism is something that we are allowed to naturalize, to hide, as he says, in plain sight, with independence, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that really didn't tell any truth and didn't reconcile anything. Those rituals of independence, which hide the continued and now normalized hyper exploitation of Africans as people who live, again, as he says, people who live in harm's way. We've not moved ourselves out of harm's way. So how do we decolonize? We've got to understand the depth of the problem first. Somewhere. We've got to extract it.
I like what the professor said there, which is an expression we use a lot in Zimbabwean expression, especially in Shona. It's where, for example, if you had to think about being stabbed, or you're stabbed and the item that stabbed you broke, which means it's now embedded inside you, and to extract it is not so easy. It's not as simple as pulling it out as it was, used to stab you in the first place. But I think you're right, Professor. The self-liberation is the way forward. We have to have a progressive mindset. And I think the key is in the mindset. The battleground is now in the mind for us to realize who our true self is. And as you've said, these conversations are the grounds for us to re-understand that I and I concept you're talking about is in my image. And then I suppose this reinforces, I think there's a lot of expression around Ubuntu, working together. Takura, I'll come to you. I think I saw some comments. Were there any comments and questions? And then we've got a raised hand waiting for us to address.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't see the raised hand. I have a question for you, Professor, from Carol Nyakachana, a community member here in Northern Ireland. First of all, I'll just read exactly what she says so you can get the spirit of it. Thank you so much, JOINHER Network and ACSONI and Professor Mhoze. We are grateful for you educating us. I really learned a lot tonight. Where can we purchase Professor Chikowero's books, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Nat. We can begin to talk about that thing and take another 2 hours. The political economy of knowledge and knowledge production. So the book, the short answer, the quick and short answer is that the book is available at Indiana Invest Press, iup.edu. You can get the soft cover, you can get a hardcover, you can get an e-book that you can start reading now. I think there's also an audio version of it. But the long answer is more complicated. At the limited number of these books, one influential colleague, well, somebody who became a colleague, actually brother, who listened to me talking about the book in Zimbabwe, helped me to ship boxes of it, put them in the National Gallery and elsewhere at the airport. Now they are sold out. Our publishers in Zimbabwe and elsewhere on the continent, they don't invest in knowledge production. Very, 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 very difficult subject. But Professor Zeleza talks about the manufacturing of African studies and crisis. His book, it could not be published here in the US. He had published it in Senegal. But it hits hard. It hits hard not just at the colonial system, but also our spaces of knowledge production on the continent, which don't invest in knowledges that we should really invest in. I tried to get published on the continent to co-publish this book on the continent. you get the usual. It's not the syllabus, which syllabus is it on, what. Some knowledge you don't put on a syllabus. So who has the money to set up publishing presses on the continent? Maybe I should abandon this whole research and writing and just do publishing. It's a huge industry that is colonially controlled. But the book is there. Also Amazon, but I don't own Amazon. So I'll get maybe 2 cents if you buy it on Amazon, or even from my publishers, I'll get 2 cents. But the knowledge is worth much more than 2 cents, I hope, and the satisfaction that we are reading our own ideas.
Well, we will be sure to preserve, at least maybe hide a book in the ground somewhere and just give us a map so we know where it is. But I think Trent has got his hand raised. Trent, I'm going to allow you to speak if you want to, and then you can address the professor directly if you'd like. So I'm just going to allow you to speak, if that's okay.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, lovely. I just wanted to go back to the self-liberation issue or concept, or what you spoke about. I think I agree, that's where sort of the key is, because for me, sometimes I feel very hopeless, if I can put it that way. You know, I'm quite conscious of some of the things, what's going on. But there are times when you wake up and you think, are we going to get out of this? Is this going to happen in our time? Is there any progress? Because I can't see the measurement of the progress of who is crossing the line. All I'm faced with every single day is there seems to be very, very little progress, if any. Otherwise, there's actually going backwards. And the kind of tools that are used to measure the progress, I'm not sure whether they are our own terms of what we well, should I call them our own terms, or not our own terms, or maybe new terms of reference for what we might call reference. And I'm faced with a vicious circle of different concept of how we measure what we call progress, which leaves us with a lot of no unity. I can't find a unifying point. So when you mentioned self-liberation, I'm thinking, wow, that's where the answer could be, or that's where the answer is. But obviously the language that we use is not our own tool. And I think by utilizing that tool on its own, you know, it always leaves us short somewhere, somehow. But going back to the self-liberation itself, can you, I don't know, give us just a little bit on self-liberation and how we can try to help ourselves, our families, each other? That's number one. And two, how do we measure ourselves' progress in such a divided, ourselves as divided as we are? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, brother man. Yeah, I do share your frustration. It is a story of our existence. It is that state of and consciousness of being disarmed. So the first thing I think basically is the language that we use. Where we are using Chiduna here now, English, Chiduna, the language of the ghosts who came to do these things to us. We can often use the truths there are limitations, the tools of the witches to de-witch ourselves. It is possible, but language can all just be one way to articulate our thoughts. So we can talk about language as something that is just a means to get to our thought process, to our epistemes. Because again, the challenge for me when I'm writing, when you do read the book, you see that I use a lot of Chikaranga words that some would call Shona. But I don't use Shona. Shona is a colonial construct even. So these colonists didn't even stop at forcing us to speak their languages. They've even distorted our own identities and what we call ourselves. So the quandary for me then would be, okay, do I write about Kuzisunungura in the language of Kuzisunungura, the Karanga language? Kuzisunungura is to free oneself. Very, very clear. Wondo Sununguko, the war of liberation, Kuzisunungura. You're starting from the source, from what our ancestors and theoreticians like Amilcar Cabral and others. You go back to where? To the source. Unfortunately, Ngara is not in the circle now, but he does use those symbols to talk about African writing systems. That's where the knowledge is. The writing is there. If I take this, it was kind of chilly day today, so I was putting this scarf around my neck. We've got writing systems that encode our thought process and systems. So the Roman system can be taken as just a means. And then how do we measure? But if I go there, if you look at the history of African language and education, I mean, by education, I mean self-education, not the colonial system. That really also came under severe attack and erasure and silencing. And the languages that people used also attacked very much. We've lost a lot of the language as a result. So, like if you look at Mozambique under the Portuguese, Africans were forbidden from using their own language, which the Portuguese designated dog's language. Now, when your whole language and instruments of thought are designated as dog's language, which child is going to proudly use that dog's language in both school and home? That ostracization, this production of identities of shame. You discard the language, what have you lost? So the over 2,000 African languages have got these deep understandings of what self-liberation is. Now we put all these languages together. None is bigger than the other. You know, part of my work now involves going through the liberation war camps where our fighters were trained in the 1960s and 70s, where the communities there talk about Wapigania wa Uhuru, the fighters for self-liberation, for independence. The language is just a minor distance. The concept is the same. Even the language itself is basically the same thing. But what would we learn if we take seriously all these languages and make lots of them into our official languages and put them in the curriculum? And we go to the core of the concepts beyond the languages themselves. then how do we make the progress if we are making progress? Are we regressing? Are we progressing? So the language itself again comes back because we tend to use concepts that come to us predefined by the very same people who use the language of development when actually they mean to destroy development. So that when they say developing countries, they're actually hiding what is actually happening on the continent. Because a lot of these countries that are called developing are actually not developing. It's a sanitizing rubric that's hiding what is actually happening, what they're actually continuing to do. So we must discard a lot of this language. When we do things for ourselves and when we heal ourselves of this ruination, when we try to fix things, when we try to regenerate the African life worlds, let's not use even the language of development. Terminology is very, very important. You can normalize rot and ruination. But then if you look at practical instances in our lives as Africans, there are moments when we address this problem and when we really made significant progress. I ended the talk with those songs, those lyrics by students in mission stations. They didn't give up. They were fighting. In many ways, they were singing the songs that had been sung by their parents and ancestors way back, going back to maybe the 1600s and 1400s when they fought the first Europeans who attempted to colonize us. We defeated them. That was significant progress. When the Khoi beat the Portuguese in the 14 and 1500s, we don't identify and celebrate these historical moments enough as lessons and models. We don't celebrate the fact that in the Zimbabwean space, we beat the Portuguese in the 1600s and freed ourselves of their enslaving and colonizing agenda and captured their cannons, which are still there in the museum in Pretoria. So we hide all these things. We don't research sufficiently and tell ourselves properly the greatest moment in African history in the contemporary times, which is the wars of self-liberation. It's a project that did not start and end there. It was not an event. It was a process. People who left their countries from Namibia, from Guinea, from elsewhere, as wakimbizi, as the Swahili speakers would say, refugees, to come back as wapigania uhuru, as liberation fighters. I would not have gone through even that colonial school to be able to think and rethink what education means if people had not taken the gun to fight Smith and his folks who really, again, were making sure that we're only becoming hewers and wood of wood and drawers of water per Rhodes design. So it's little chips as we go. That was Chimurenga. These wars of African self-liberation, we can also call them Chimurenga, because that's what Murenga, our great ancestor, bestowed on us, to fight for self-liberation. And hence Chimurenga, to fight like Murenga, these guerrilla wars. We need to wage what I call Chimurenga Chepfungwa. Pull out the worm that infected our thinking and our epistemes. The Chimurenga of the gun opened the door. What are we doing with the legacies of that? So I am going to the liberation war camps in all these countries, speaking with people who hosted and trained and provisioned these people. And I'm talking to the fighters to understand that process so that we can really say now, okay, what do we achieve? Let's do the accounting. Where is the story now? Where's the agenda now? How do we redefine it? How do we build on it? Because there is more investment in destroying that legacy than in celebrating and building on that legacy. But we don't take ourselves seriously enough as a people. I mean, because sometimes because I'm under-resourced, I'm doing videos with my phone. But if I'm studying something about some other subject that's not threatening to the system, I'm given equipment. What does that say about knowledge production?
Thank you so much, Professor. One of the intriguing things about your talk for me personally is I consider myself a person that is very interested in the use of language, especially the colonial languages that we that we have been exposed to, namely English, French, and Spanish, Portuguese to a lesser extent, but still. I don't speak much French. I don't speak any Spanish or Portuguese. However, obviously, my competency is in English. And you learn something every day. And although I love analyzing words, one of the words that you mentioned today, recreation, that really, 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 really struck a chord with me, because when you said it, I understood the meaning of it within the colonial and oppressive context. You know, recreating somebody to mold them into what you want so that they can be, as you said, hewers of wood and drawers of water. So I just wanted to comment on that. That really, it really struck a chord with me, because again, it's a word that we use almost every day, like all the other words, you know, rest and recreation. You know, I'm going to take some R&R after this long webinar. So am I going to take out what the professor has just put in and recreate myself to mold myself back to what I was, which is not who I am, but I was molded or recreated into that person? I mean, wow. No wonder I forgot the chairman's name, you know.
You're looking for an alibi, not no. I'm joking. You're onto something serious. That's really the point.
It is, and I think you're right in everything you're saying, Professor. I mean, we could have you here for hours, because I think what you're saying is at the root of a lot of things. And I think if we can get more of our own, as in ourselves, that we can sit down with, and as you so rightfully said, the wisdom is among us. It's how do we find a way to uniform it, package it, and keep mass producing it. That's the $1 million secret. And I don't know, Trent, do you feel you've been sufficiently answered? I know we've kept you up here just to reassure that you've been sufficiently answered. And if you haven't, please get in touch with us. There's ACSONI, there's JOINHER. We would love to have further conversations. Where are you based, Trent, if we can ask, so we can perhaps pursue the conversation of Ubuntu, which is what we're trying to achieve? Yes, he's answered. Okay. Good to hear, Trent. Okay. Okay. So I don't know if there's no more questions in the room. Professor, I think you have left us with a lot to go and think about. The next time we're walking past the mirror, we have to make sure, who are we seeing, and whose image is being superimposed on the reflection? I guess is the $1 million question that we all need to answer. And if we're not sure, we can get in touch with you. There's more ways to have conversations further. I think we will be open for that, and there will be more opportunities for everyone in the audience to engage with you further, because I think your work is not done yet, Professor. We still have quite a lot for you to do. and we will utilize this wealth of knowledge that you have. And you can be, as we need in our society at this moment, one of those individuals who's sharpening us. As iron sharpens iron, I think is the next venture that we're on. Takura, I'll come to you and perhaps you can wrap us up and we'll let everybody have their lives back.
Thank you. I'll just comment quickly. Trent has just said, yes, he has been answered and he hopes this will continue, these kind of dialogues. I can assure you, Trent, that ACSONI, with our partners like JOINHER and the good professor, we will continue to deliver as many programs as possible, not only webinars, but we have programs on the ground here in Northern Ireland that we are pursuing. The professor is in California. There's nothing stopping us from reaching out to the professor, bringing him here, or going out to the mountain itself. We are ready to do that. This is, I wanted to comment on a question which Trent, I believe, asked about how we move forward in this context. I just wanted to go back to a saying that you will find in many of our African cultures. He who grows the tree does not grow it expecting to sit in its shade. So, as our ancestors Mbuya Nehanda, Kaguvi, and many others fought for our liberty, they did not enjoy those liberties. So it is a conscious acknowledgement that we must, as adults and Africans and human beings, we must accept that we are going to have to sacrifice for future generations. So we are not going to be the beneficiaries of this Chimurenga. However, there will be beneficiaries. Be assured of that.
Asante sana, Nyat.
Totally agree.
Asante sana, Masibanda.
Yes.
Thank
And
Trent is also a Nyat.
Exactly.
I've never thanked you sufficiently, Nyat Makon. I was with your father in August, and kind of touched on something that I've always wanted to really talk to you and your father about, elder, Nyat the elder. You know, the whole concept of food is something that is really, really significant. I'll be home in December. Maybe this time I'll actually sit down with him and talk about what he and you are trying to do there at Kwamrong. Because food is one of the most important vistas of colonization and avenues for self-liberation. And so this is to say that what you're trying to do there with food, I don't know if you really fully consciously articulate this. Do you have blueprints, as the colonizer said, blueprints on how to destroy us? Do you have blueprints on how to utilize food as one of our cultural weapons to free ourselves of the colonial foodstuffs that are killing us on the continent and in the world today? But again, this is to say, I don't want to elongate the conversation. This is just to say, again, asante sana.
Tinobonga.
Notend. Notend, Anyat.
Thank you. We seem to have two more comments before we close off. Charlene Machaira says, thank you, Professor Mhoze. Thank you, JOINHER and ACSONI. Thank you too for joining us and staying with us. Charlene, thank you so much.
Thanks, Charlene. Charlene is one of our grad students here from Kenya.
They're in California.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for joining us, Charlene. We are honored. Josephine Mudzingwa says to everyone, I can't see other participants except 3 people. Well, I can assure you that there are more than 3 of us here. There are 8 participants and 3 panelists. So Be assured, we are here.
Thanks for being here with us, Josephine.
Thank you, Joseph.
It's the beauty of technology, Josephine. If we had a Zoom meeting, we would see everybody, but webinar lets us cheat a little bit. So it gives a bit more discretion. So you're not under pressure to show yourselves and speak to us. But we appreciate that everyone stayed the course with us, and it's been an excellent conversation. Wow, I'm the first Black counselor in 48 years. Where, Josephine?
Where is NTC?
I'll probably allow you to speak, Josephine. Are you happy to do that? I'll let you speak. Here, we'll add you to the conversation. Hi. Hello, how are you?
Am I?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, yeah. I'm in England. I'm in a place called North Tyneside, next to Newcastle.
Okay.
And yeah, well, we're trying to follow Martin Luther's dream, which is actually taking so long, because it has been 48 years to have a first Black councillor. I got elected in May, on the 5th of May, and I'm the only Black person in the chamber. It's lonely. That's all I can say. Yeah, but the racism in this side is worse than the one in America, because people in America, if they don't like you, they will tell you that they don't like you. At least you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, everything is covered right under the carpet. I was rejected 7 times before I actually got to be elected. But it wasn't even the people who are outside, but the people who are inside. They kind of like they will try by all means to make sure that you cannot become a candidate. And I felt that I was a slave in a way, because the interview was asking me, how do you solve a problem in Medwell area? Then you can tell them all the answers, everything. I would plan like this, I would invite tourists, I will do this, I will do this. On crime level, I will do that, I will do that. Then they will invite their other to reject you as a group. And then you go to the next ward, then you do all the research. And after, when I was when I was fed up, I really didn't care. That is the one the one word. After I failed, I filed for racism, and then after I filed the racism, they expelled the person. She was a white lady who was actually seconding my my claim of racism, because I went to a ward where there was 0 candidates competing, and I was the only candidate. It was in the middle of nowhere. But my advisors, they just said, Josephine, it doesn't matter. Just go for it, even if it's far away in the middle of nowhere. What we need to do is you just need to be a counselor. It doesn't matter whether there are people or no people, you can still be a counselor there. We need a first Black counselor. So I went there, and the people who were interviewing, they were just 3 of that branch. And then there was the chairperson and an observer. And then the chairperson, who actually said, oh, Josephine, your interview was fantastic. And they said they were not going to take me because they didn't have a choice. They needed more people to come to be interviewed. So I filed for racism. And then before I know it, I'm thinking head office is going to reply me, blah, blah, blah. Then they fired the lady who actually had been supporting my case, which means my case was just useless. I couldn't have a witness. And then finally, my last ward, Karma just beat them really good because I beat a sitting councillor who was a cabinet member, and all the seats were finished. So he didn't have anywhere to become a councillor or cabinet member. That's how God works. That's my story for today.
Well, talk about disarmament, Josephine. I think you've taken disarmament to the next level. Congratulations. And I think because you're not too far away, by all means, do stay in touch. You know,
where are you? Where are you guys? I was just invited. Somebody just told me, like, we are in we say no to racism WhatsApp group. So the guy just said, just log in. So we were like, it's almost finished. We are not gonna log in.
Okay, but thank you for logging in, because I think here in Northern Ireland, I think we only have one Black councillor, a female from Kenya. The other councillor is Zimbabwean also, but she's white. So it, in a way, it doesn't count for the purpose of what we're trying to do, because she can blend in quite easily, as opposed to us. It's very visibly obvious that we're not white, of course. So you don't have to feel that you're alone. We're not too far away. If you're in mainland UK, we're literally 55 minutes, no more than an hour to get to where we are. And let's keep the lines of communication open. There's strength in numbers. And I believe this meeting is just the beginning of these minds, as the professor said, being reconstructed, and the members of the body being reconstituted, essentially. So we're good to go, I think.
Please follow our social media for ACSONI JOINHER, as well as the professor, to keep abreast of different developments within our cultural and academic space, so we can keep doing this job, keep fighting the good fight. Professor, once again, our deep gratitude to you for giving us your time. And to all the participants, thank you so much. To you, Lori, thank you as well for helping us to host this event. And I'm looking forward to hosting many more, not only digital events, but the physical events. So let's keep on fighting. And Josephine, just in response to your last question, yes, we can come to your party and you can come to ours too. So there's strength in numbers.
Yes, there is. So I think onwards and upwards, the Chimurenga war has begun. So here we are.
Thank you.
So,
Asante sana.
Sana.
thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
All right, bye.